The fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending shadows dancing across walls that had stood for 30 years. Outside Montana, winter howled against the windows, but inside the Cole farmhouse, warmth held its ground. Nathan Cole sat in his leather chair, the one that had molded itself to his body over 2 decades of evening vigils. At 72 years old, his hair had gone white as the snow beyond the glass, but his eyes remained sharp as cavalry steel. Those eyes had seen too much, done too much, remembered everything. His grandson Daniel sat cross-legged on the bearskin rug, 19 years old and restless with the energy of youth that doesn't yet know what the world costs. He was polishing a pair of new leather boots. Army boots. Tomorrow morning he would board a train to San Francisco, then a ship to the Philippines, where American soldiers were fighting a war that newspapers called necessary. Nathan watched the boy work, seeing in him echoes of men long dead. The same jaw, the same stubborn set of the shoulders, the same ignorance of what lay ahead. $2. Daniel looked up, confused by the words that seemed to come from nowhere. Nathan's voice was rough as gravel, worn down by decades of silence and sorrow. That's what a human life cost on a September morning in Arizona Territory, 1878. $2 silver tossed in the dirt like payment for a lame horse. The young man set down his boots, sensing something important in his grandfather's tone. In 19 years, he had never heard the old man speak of the past. Not really, just fragments. Shadows of stories that always trailed off into silence. Grandma Grace, Nathan nodded slowly, his weathered hand reaching for the leather journal that rested on the table beside him. The book was old, its pages yellowed, its binding cracked from years of handling. He opened it carefully, reverently, the way a priest might open a sacred text. She wasn't born with that name. And the story of those $2, he paused, his eyes distant, seeing something far beyond the cabin walls. It changed everything I thought I knew about living, about dying, about what matters when both are stripped away. He turned to the final pages where a faded photograph was pressed between sheets of tissue paper. 2 figures stood before a small stone church. A man in his 40s, beard dark and trimmed, close the scar on his face visible, even in the grainy image. Beside him, a woman in a simple white dress, her hair pulled back with tortoiseshell combs. She wasn't smiling in the picture, but her eyes held a fire that the camera had somehow captured. This was our wedding day, 18 months after I bought her for $2 silver in a dusty trading post yard. Daniel leaned forward. You never told me the whole story. Because I wasn't ready, and because you didn't need to hear it. Nathan looked at his grandson, really looked. Seeing the fear beneath the excitement, the doubt beneath the determination. But tomorrow you leave. You'll see things that will change you. Things you can't unsee, can't unfeel, can't undo. And I want you to know that no matter what happens over there, no matter what you do or what's done to you, there's always a road back. Always a way to build something from the ashes. Grandpa, Daniel hesitated, his voice dropping. Did you ever kill anyone? The question hung in the air between them, heavy as gun smoke. More than I could count during the war, and some after. Nathan didn't look away, didn't soften the truth. But that's not the question that matters, boy. The question that matters is how many did I save? And what did I build from the blood and the fire? He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he was no longer in Montana. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere hot and dusty and 30 years gone. It started in September of 1878, Arizona Territory. I was 42 years old, living alone in the mountains, trying to forget everything I'd ever been. Husband, father, soldier, scout. I wanted to be nobody. I wanted to disappear into the wilderness and never come back. He touched the photograph gently, and then I saw her, being dragged through a trading post yard like an animal for sale, and everything I thought I'd buried came roaring back to life. The morning sun hung merciless over Yuma Trading Post, baking the hard-packed earth until heat waves shimmered like water in a desert mirage. Dust clung to everything, coating hitching posts and porch rails and the sweat-soaked shirts of men who had gathered not for commerce but for entertainment. Nathan Cole stood in the shadow of the general store's overhang, his back against a wooden post worn smooth by decades of leaning shoulders. His cavalry hat, battered and faded from years of hard use, cast his face in darkness. The scar that ran from his right temple to his jawline, a souvenir from Gettysburg 15 years past, was hidden in the shadow. But his eyes were visible, gray as gunmetal, cold as mountain streams, watching. He had come to buy ammunition, 50 caliber rounds for his Sharps rifle, the one that had seen him through the war and the empty years that followed. He had come for tobacco, the one luxury he allowed himself in his self-imposed exile. He had not come to get involved in other people's troubles. Those days were over, had been over for 8 years, ever since he'd buried the last piece of his heart in Kansas soil and ridden west to find a place where memories couldn't follow. In the center of the yard, a crowd of perhaps 20 men had formed a loose half-circle, miners with dirt still under their fingernails, traders with calculating eyes, drifters with no particular destination and all the time in the world. A few hired guns recognizable by the way they wore their holsters low and loose, and in the center of them all, Frank Dawson. Nathan knew the type without knowing the man. 40 years old but looking 50, body gone soft from whiskey and easy living, face flushed, red with drink, even at this early hour. His vest was stained with food and sweat, his teeth yellow when he smiled, which was often and never pleasantly. In his right hand he held a length of rope. The other end was tied around the wrists of a woman. $2, Dawson bellowed, his voice carrying across the yard with the confidence of a man who knew he held all the power. That's all I'm asking. $2 for a strong Apache woman who can cook clean hall water and do whatever else a man might need. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the ugly kind, the kind that made Nathan's jaw tighten involuntarily. He should leave, should turn around, buy his supplies, and ride back into the mountains where the only voices were wind and wolves. This wasn't his fight. This wasn't his concern. He had made promises to himself, and those promises had kept him alive and sane for 8 years. But something made him stay. Something made him watch. The woman knelt in the dirt, her knees bleeding through the torn fabric of her dress. The garment had once been blue. Nathan could see traces of the color at the hem, but now it was gray with dust and dark with dried blood. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, had been cut short and ragged, as if someone had hacked at it with a dull knife. It fell across her face, partially hiding her features. Her shoulders were bare where the dress had torn, revealing skin marked with bruises in the distinctive shape of boot heels. Someone had kicked her, repeatedly, recently. Dawson yanked the rope, pulling her forward, and she stumbled, but didn't fall. That was the first thing Nathan noticed. Despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her body, despite the pain she must have been feeling, she caught herself, kept her balance, stayed upright. That wasn't the posture of a broken woman. That was the posture of someone waiting for an opportunity. $1, someone called from the crowd. She ain't worth more with all them bruises. $1, Dawson spat into the dirt. I paid the patrol, 5 for her. She's Apache stock, strong as a mule and twice as stubborn. He grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking her head back. Show him you still got teeth, girl. Nathan's hand drifted to the Colt Navy revolver at his hip, fingers resting on the worn grip without conscious thought. Old habits, war habits, the kind that never really died. The woman's head came up, and for the first time, Nathan saw her face clearly. High cheekbones, a small scar, crescent-shaped, beneath her left ear, and eyes, gray blue eyes the color of a storm gathering over mountains. Those eyes weren't defeated, weren't pleading. They were watching, calculating, waiting. She looked at the crowd, scanning faces with the careful attention of someone cataloging threats and opportunities. Her gaze swept past Nathan, paused, and came back. For one heartbeat, their eyes met, and Nathan saw something that made his chest constrict. Recognition, not of him specifically, but of what he was. She had looked at every man in that crowd and seen predators. She looked at him and saw something different, something she couldn't quite trust, but couldn't dismiss either. Then her eyes moved on and the moment passed. But something had shifted. Something inside Nathan that he had thought dead and buried had stirred in its grave. $2 final offer, Dawson was shouting now, his patience wearing thin. Anyone who don't want her, I'll take her down to the border. The boys in Mexico ain't so picky. More laughter, more crude jokes, more voices calling out lower numbers just to see Dawson's face turn redder. Nathan pushed himself off the post and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd parted for him without conscious thought, the way a stream parts around a boulder. Nobody wanted to stand too close to the tall stranger with the scar and the dead eyes. Nobody wanted to meet his gaze. They didn't know who he was, most of them, but they knew what he was. Dangerous. The kind of man who had killed and would kill again without hesitation. He walked to the center of the yard and stopped 10 feet from Dawson. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and withdrew 2 silver coins. He tossed them at Dawson's feet, where they landed in the dust with soft metallic sounds that seemed louder than gunshots in the sudden silence. "I'll take her." Dawson's eyes widened, then narrowed as he tried to place the stranger's face. "Mister, you know what you're buying. She goes with me." Nathan's voice was low, but it carried. Each word separate, each word final. He moved his coat aside just slightly, revealing the Colt at his hip and the tarnished cavalry badge pinned inside his jacket. A reminder, a warning. Dawson looked around for support, but the men who had been laughing moments before were suddenly very interested in the ground, the sky, anywhere but the confrontation unfolding before them. Nobody wanted to stand with Dawson against the man from the mountains. Nobody wanted to find out if the stories were true. "Fine." Dawson bent to pick up the coins, his movements jerky with barely suppressed rage. "Take her. But don't say I didn't warn you. She's wild as a Mustang and twice as mean. Probably got diseases, too." Nathan drew his knife, a Bowie blade with a handle worn smooth from years of use. Several men stepped back, hands moving toward their weapons. But Nathan simply walked forward and cut the rope binding the woman's wrists. The frayed ends fell to the dirt. For the first time, she looked directly at him, her gray-blue eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt almost physical. "You're free," Nathan said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "If you want to leave on your own, I'll give you a horse and supplies. Nobody's forcing you to go anywhere." She studied him for a long moment, reading him, weighing him. "I have nowhere to go," she finally said. Her voice was hoarse from thirst but steady, educated. The accent was American, not Apache. "And you are not like them." It wasn't a question. "I have a cabin in the mountains, safe. You can stay until you figure out where you want to be." She nodded once, a small motion that somehow conveyed both acceptance and reservation. Trust that could be withdrawn at any moment. Cooperation that came with conditions. Nathan led her to his horse, a chestnut gelding named Whiskey, who had been his companion for 8 years. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of the trading post, he felt eyes on his back, Dawson's eyes burning with humiliation and rage. "This isn't over," those eyes said. Nathan knew it. He had known it from the moment he stepped out of the shadows. But some things couldn't be ignored, no matter how much a man wanted to disappear. They rode for 2 hours before Nathan spoke again. The landscape had changed around them, shifting from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines. The air was cooler here, cleaner, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant water. Nathan had chosen a route that wound through canyons and along ridgelines, avoiding the main trails. Every 15 minutes he glanced behind them, checking for pursuit. The woman sat straight in the saddle, not leaning against him, despite what must have been bone-deep exhaustion. Her spine was rigid, her shoulders tense, her head constantly moving as she took in the terrain around them. She wasn't just riding, she was mapping, memorizing, planning. "You're not Apache," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. She turned her head slightly, acknowledging his words without quite looking at him. "No. But you've lived with them." 5 years. Her voice was stronger now, the hoarseness fading to the water he'd given her at their first rest stop. "Near Fort Apache, I ran a school for the children." Nathan processed this information, rearranging his assumptions. "A teacher, a nun." She paused. "Sister Margaret Ellen Shaw of the Sisters of Mercy, or I was before." The words hit Nathan like a physical blow. A nun. Not an Apache woman sold by slavers, but a white woman. A religious woman, disguised by dirt and short hair and desperation. "Why didn't you tell them?" "I did tell them." Her voice went flat. "I told Frank Dawson the day he bought me. He laughed. Said no one would believe an Apache squaw claiming to be a nun. Said if I kept lying, he'd cut out my tongue to keep me quiet." Nathan felt his hands tighten on the reins. How did a nun end up being sold in a trading post? She was quiet for a long moment, and Nathan thought she might not answer. Then she spoke, her words measured, careful. In March of this year, the village where I worked was attacked. Soldiers led by a colonel named Victor Reed. They came at night when everyone was sleeping. They killed everyone, women, children, elders. The soldiers called it a pacification operation against hostile Indians. She drew a breath. But I was there. I saw. They weren't hostile. They weren't even awake. Nathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Victor Reed. He had heard that name before. In reports, in rumors, in the bitter complaints of settlers who had lost everything and blamed Indians for what felt wrong. Why didn't they kill you? Because I'm white. Killing a white woman, even a nun living with Apache, would have raised questions. Her voice took on an edge of bitter humor. But they couldn't let me go either. I had seen too much, so they sold me, passed me from one owner to another for 6 months until I ended up with Dawson. And no one believed you were a nun. Look at me. She gestured at herself, at the torn dress and the short hair and the sun-darkened skin. I look like what they wanted me to look like. And by the time Dawson got me, I had learned to stop talking about who I was. It only made things worse. They rode in silence for another mile, the only sounds the steady clop of Whiskey's hooves and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then she spoke again. I have something I've kept hidden for 6 months through everything. She reached down to the hem of her dress, where the fabric was oddly thick. Her fingers found a seam, worked it open, and withdrew a small book bound in oilcloth. Evidence, she said, holding it up. I wrote down everything. Dates, names, locations, every crime Colonel Reed committed, every person he killed. She turned slightly to look at Nathan. He didn't just kill Apache, he killed white settlers too. Anyone who wouldn't sell their land to the railroad. The cold feeling in Nathan's stomach turned to ice. White settlers, land sales, railroad. My homestead was in Kansas, he heard himself say, April of 1870. They told me Comanche raiders attacked. He paused, forcing the words out. But I saw the footprints afterward. White men's boots, not moccasins. She turned further, her gray-blue eyes meeting his. Who did you lose? My wife, my son. The words came out, rough, scraped raw from a wound that had never healed. Thomas was 3 years old. Silence stretched between them, heavy with shared grief and dawning understanding. I have records of attacks in Kansas, she said softly. 1869 and 1870. Attacks blamed on Comanche that weren't Comanche at all. If you tell me the exact location and date, I might be able to. Cole, Nathan interrupted. The Cole homestead near Lawrence, April 15th, 1870. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened the oilcloth-wrapped book and began turning pages. Nathan's cabin came into view as the sun touched the western peaks. It sat in a small valley accessible only through a narrow canyon, a natural fortress that had appealed to his soldier's instincts when he had first found it 8 years ago. 20 feet by 16 built of cedar logs he had cut and notched himself. A stone chimney rose from the roof. A small barn stood nearby along with a corral that currently held half a dozen cattle. A creek ran past 50 feet from the front door, clear and cold year-round. But something was wrong. The cabin door stood open. 3 horses Nathan didn't recognize were tied to the porch rail. Down, he whispered to the woman, his hand already reaching for the Sharps rifle secured to his saddle. Stay low. She flattened herself against the horse's neck without question, without hesitation. The movement was smooth, practiced. Whatever else she had been through in the past 6 months, she had learned how to react to danger. Nathan guided Whiskey behind a large boulder and dismounted, keeping the rifle ready. Through the gaps in the rocks, he could see movement in the cabin. Men were emerging, their arms full of supplies. His supplies. Dried meat, ammunition, a bottle of whiskey from his stores. 3 men, thieves. The kind of vultures that had plagued the frontier since the war ended, preying on isolated homesteads and lone travelers. Nathan had dealt with their kind before. That's far enough, he called out, stepping from behind the boulder. His voice echoed across the small valley, flat and cold. The thieves dropped their loot, hands flying to their weapons. But Nathan had been a scout for General Sherman. He had killed more men than he could remember, and he had done it from ambush, from concealment, from positions just like this one. The first man was still clearing leather when Nathan's bullet caught him center chest. The .50 caliber round from the Sharps was designed to drop buffalo at 300 yards. At 60 feet, it punched through the man's bodies and into the cabin wall behind him, spraying red across cedar logs. The second man managed to get a shot off. The bullet whined past Nathan's ear close enough that he felt the displaced air. But Nathan had already reloaded the practice motion, taking less than 3 seconds, and his return fire caught the second thief in the chest as well. The third man raised his hands. "Don't shoot, I surrender." Nathan kept the rifle trained on him, watching for any movement, any deception. A man who surrendered that quickly was either a coward or planning something. The man's hand twitched toward his boot. Nathan fired. The bullet took him between the eyes. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the echo of gunshots fading into the mountains. 3 bodies lay in the dirt. The whole encounter had taken less than 10 seconds. The woman raised her head, looking at the scene with an expression Nathan couldn't quite read. Not horror, not revulsion, something more complex: assessment, reevaluation. "You're fast," she said. "I'm sorry you had to see that." Nathan lowered the rifle but didn't holster it. "I didn't want you to know this part of me so soon." "Don't apologize." She sat up fully, her eyes moving from body to body with clinical detachment. "I've seen worse, much worse. At least these men had weapons. At least they had a chance to defend themselves." Nathan looked at her, understanding what she wasn't saying. The people in the Apache village hadn't had weapons, hadn't had a chance, had been asleep when the soldiers came. They buried the 3 thieves in a rocky area away from the creek where they wouldn't contaminate the water supply. Nathan worked in silence, digging graves with a shovel from the barn, while she kept watch with the shotgun he'd given her. When it was done, they went inside. The cabin was simple but well organized. Everything in its place, the habit of a man who had lived alone for years. A single bed in one corner. A wooden table with 2 stools. A shelf lined with books, their spines worn from handling. A gun rack on the wall holding a Winchester lever action and a double-barreled shotgun. "You can have the back room," Nathan said, pulling aside a canvas curtain to reveal a small space with a narrow cot. "There's a bowl on the inside. Lock it if you want. I'll sleep out here by the fire." She looked at the room, then back at him. "Why are you doing this? You bought me. According to Arizona territory law, I'm your property. You could do whatever you wanted." Nathan was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "During the war, I saw what men become when they treat other humans as things. I swore I would never stand by and watch it happen again." He met her eyes directly. "You're free. You can leave whenever you want. You can stay as long as you need. No conditions, no expectations." She studied his face, the scar, the lines of old pain, the eyes that had seen too much but somehow still held a spark of humanity. "I'll stay," she decided, "at least until I figure out what to do with this." She touched the oilcloth-wrapped book still tucked inside her dress. "And please call me Grace. I stopped being Sister Margaret when they burned my habit." "Grace," Nathan repeated. The name felt right somehow. "I'm Nathan Cole." That night, Grace locked herself in the small room while Nathan sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees. Neither of them slept well. Nathan because he was listening for danger. Grace because she had forgotten what safety felt like. But something had changed between them. Something small. A crack in the walls they had both built around themselves. A first step towards something neither of them had expected to find. Part 2. The Alliance. The first week passed in careful silence. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Nathan woke before dawn, made coffee on the wood stove, and left a cup outside Grace's door before going to tend the animals. Grace emerged later, cleaned the cabin, prepared simple meals from the supplies they had. They ate together but spoke little. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had been alone for so long that they had forgotten how to make small talk, but who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with noise. Nathan observed her as he would observe any potential threat, cataloging her habits, her skills, her patterns. She moved efficiently with the economy of someone accustomed to hard work. She knew how to start a fire, how to preserve food, how to treat minor injuries. When she thought he wasn't watching, she would take out her book and add entries in a small, precise hand. On the 5th day, Grace came out to the corral where Nathan was mending a broken rail. She held a book from his shelf. "Whitman's Leaves of Grass. You read poetry." There was surprise in her voice. Nathan didn't stop hammering. "My wife liked Whitman. She used to read to me every night. The hammer fell twice before Grace spoke again. How long ago? 8 years. Nathan straightened in, looking toward the mountains. Sarah was her name. Thomas was 3 years old when they died. Did you ever find out who did it? No, the official report said Comanche, but I knew they were lying. I saw the boot prints. Tracked them for 2 years before the trail went cold. Grace sat on the corral fence, the book closed on her lap. I've been looking through my records. April 1870, Kansas. There were 3 homesteads attacked that month, all blamed on Comanche raids. Nathan's hammer stopped mid-swing. The land from all 3 was bought by Kansas Pacific Railroad 6 months later. Grace continued. Purchased at a fraction of its value because it had been designated a dangerous area due to Indian activity. Slowly, Nathan lowered the hammer. The names of the homesteads, he said, his voice strange in his own ears. What were they? Grace opened her book, flipped through pages covered in small, neat writing. Henderson, Cole, Murphy. Cole, his homestead, his land, his family. There's more, Grace said quietly. One of the settlers from a neighboring farm, a man named John Patterson, survived by hiding in his root cellar. He told me what he saw before he died of his wounds. He described the attackers. She met Nathan's eyes. 12 white men dressed in Comanche clothing, led by a man with silver hair and a commanding voice, like a military officer. Nathan's hand was shaking. He hadn't noticed until he saw the hammer trembling in his grip. He didn't get a name. No, but I have something else. Grace turned to another page and removed a yellow document that had been pressed between the sheets. Patterson managed to steal this before he fled, a written order authorizing the neutralization of hostile elements in the area, signed at the bottom. She held it out to him. Nathan took it with hands that felt disconnected from his body. His eyes scanned the faded text, military language dressed up in official phrases, and at the bottom a signature in bold black ink. Colonel Victor Reed, United States Army. The paper crumpled in Nathan's fist. 8 years, he said, his voice barely a whisper. 8 years I searched for the men who killed my family, and he was right there the whole time. Grace didn't try to comfort him, didn't offer platitudes. She just sat quietly, giving him space to feel what he needed to feel. If you go after him now, you'll die, she finally said. Reed has an entire regiment under his command. He has the backing of the railroad. He has political connections. You'd be shot as a murderer before you got within 100 yards. I know. The words came out like ground glass. But if we use this evidence properly, Grace leaned forward. There's a judge in Tucson, Harrison Wells. He has a reputation for fairness, and he's not in the pocket of the railroad interest. If we can get this book to him, get these documents into the official record. Nathan looked at her, seeing something new in her expression. Not just survival instinct, not just determination. Something fiercer, something with teeth. You've been planning this, he realized, for 6 months. Her gray-blue eyes held steady on his. I didn't just want to survive Nathan Cole. I wanted justice for the people in my village, for all the people Reed has killed. She lifted her chin. And now maybe for your family, too. Jenna. The morning of the 8th day dawned bright and clear. The kind of autumn day when the sky seems impossibly blue and the air tastes like cold water. Nathan was on the barn roof repairing a section that had started to leak when Grace called from the porch. Riders coming. He was on the ground in seconds, rifle in hand, moving toward the cabin with the low, quick stride of a man who had survived 100 ambushes by never being where the enemy expected. Through his spyglass, he counted 5 riders approaching through the canyon. Frank Dawson at the front, unmistakable even at this distance by his bulk and the way he sat a horse like a sack of meal. Behind him, 4 men with the look of hired guns. Hard eyes, hands resting on weapons. The kind of men who killed for money and didn't ask questions. Inside, Nathan ordered, take the shotgun from the rack. If any of them gets past me, you use it. Grace moved without argument, without questions. She had learned to respond to danger without hesitation. When your life has been threatened often enough, you stop debating and start acting. Nathan positioned himself on the porch rifle resting against the railing. The stance looked casual, but the muzzle was pointed at the canyon mouth, and his finger was already beside the trigger. The rider stopped 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk, far enough to give them time to react if shooting started. Cole, Dawson's voice echoed across the valley, thick with rage and whiskey. You stole my property. I want her back, or I want $20 instead of the two you threw at my feet. She's a free woman on free land, Nathan called back. You're trespassing. Free, Dawson spat into the dirt. She's Apache trash. Colonel Reed has standing orders. Any hostile Indians get rounded up and dealt with. She's not Apache, and she's not hostile. The only hostiles I see are the 5 men who rode onto my property uninvited. Dawson's face went purple. Colonel Reed wants to talk to her. And what the colonel wants, the colonel gets. Reed, that name again. The name signed at the bottom of the document that had ordered his family's murder. Reed can come himself if he wants to talk, Nathan said. He can come without an army at his back and explain why he's been murdering American citizens and blaming it on Indians. The silence that followed was absolute. Then one of Dawson's men went for his gun. Nathan was faster. The sharps roared, and the hired gun spun backward off his horse, a hole the size of a fist in his shoulder. Before the others could react, Nathan had reloaded and fired again, dropping a second man who had been raising his rifle. A third gunman drew and aimed straight at Nathan's chest. His finger was on the trigger, the hammer was falling, and Nathan knew he couldn't reload in time. The gunman jerked and toppled from his saddle, a knife buried to the hilt between his shoulder blades. Nathan turned. Grace stood in the cabin doorway, her arms still extended from the throw, her eyes cold as mountain ice. My Apache students taught me, she said, her voice flat. They said a woman who could kill from a distance would never lack for respect. Dawson and the remaining man wheeled their horses and fled, firing wildly over their shoulders. One bullet caught Nathan in the left shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Grace was at his side before he could catch his balance. How bad? Nathan looked at the wound. Blood soaked through his shirt, but his arms still moved. The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone. Had worse at Shiloh, he said through gritted teeth. She helped him inside, guided him to a chair by the table. Her hands were steady as she cut away his shirt and examined the wound. Professional, practiced. Through and through, I need to clean it and stitch it closed. She looked at him. Do you trust me? He nodded. She boiled water on the stove, retrieved a needle and thread from her kit, and set to work. Her movements were sure, her stitches neat and even. While she worked, she explained, the Apache use Oregon grapefruit for infections. I learned from the village healer, and yarrow leaves to stop bleeding, and willow bark tea for the pain. Nathan gritted his teeth as the needle passed through his flesh, but didn't cry out. You're not just a nun, he said when she tied off the final stitch. No, she wrapped a clean bandage around his shoulder. I'm a survivor, and now, she secured the bandage with a neat knot. Now I'm your ally, whether you wanted one or not. Their eyes met and something passed between them, an understanding, an alliance forged not in words but in blood and action. Grace looked out the window at the 3 bodies that still lay in the yard, at the distant dust cloud marking Dawson's retreat. He mentioned Reed, as she said. Reed wants me badly enough to send armed men. That means he knows I have the book, or at least suspects. It also means he knows where we are now. Grace nodded, her jaw set. Then we can't wait. We need to get this evidence to Judge Wells before Reed can stop us. Nathan flexed his injured shoulder, testing the limits. The pain was manageable. He had fought through worse. How do we get past Reed's men? He'll have the main roads watched. There's another way. Grace turned from the window. Through the mountain, Siouans, through Apache territory. Jacob Whitehorse leads a band of warriors in those hills. He's the older brother of one of my students. I saved Little Fawn's life when she had fever. Among his people, that makes us family. Your student's brother. The Apache take debts seriously. If we can reach him, he can guide us through land the army won't enter. She looked at Nathan steadily. Apache helping white people isn't common, but Reed is their enemy even more than he's ours. The enemy of my enemy. Nathan considered this. An alliance with Apache warriors, working with the people he had been taught to fight, to fear, to hate. But hate seemed small now compared to what he had learned, compared to what Reed had done. When do we leave? Tomorrow at first light. Grace began gathering supplies, moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned that hesitation could be fatal. We need to reach Eagle Rock within 3 days. That's where Jacob will meet us if he received my message. The infection set in on the second day after the shooting. Nathan woke before dawn with his shoulder burning like someone had pressed a hot iron to the wound. The skin around the stitches had gone red and angry, swollen tight against the thread. When Grace checked it, her face went carefully blank in a way that told him everything he needed to know. The bullet was dirty, she said, unwrapping the bandage with steady hands, or the cloth from your shirt got into the wound. Either way, we need to treat this now. She worked through the morning using knowledge gathered from 5 years among the Apache. First, she cleaned the wound with water boiled and cooled, pressing gently to drain the yellow fluid that had gathered beneath the skin. Then she made a poultice from Oregon grapefruit, grinding it with a flat stone until it formed a paste the color of dried blood. This will hurt, she warned. Do it. The paste burned like fire when she pressed it into the wound. Nathan gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white, but he didn't make a sound. He had learned silence in the war, learned that noise attracted attention, and attention got men killed. Grace worked with the focused intensity of someone who had done this many times before. Her hands never trembled. Her movements never hesitated. She packed the wound with yarrow leaves to draw out the poison, then wrapped it in clean cloth torn from one of Nathan's spare shirts. You need to rest, she said when she finished, at least 2 days before you can ride. We don't have 2 days. You don't have a choice. She met his eyes with the same steel he had seen when she threw the knife. If you ride now, the infection will spread. You'll develop fever. You'll fall off your horse somewhere in the mountains and die alone. Is that what you want? Nathan looked away first. For 2 days, Grace kept him in bed, changing his bandages twice daily, making him drink bitter tea brewed from willow bark. The fever came anyway on the first night, mild but persistent, leaving him weak and irritable. During the long hours of recovery, they talked. Not about Reed, not about the journey ahead, about other things, smaller things. The things that make up a life when you strip away the violence and the loss. Grace told him about Boston, about her father, the minister who believed women existed only to obey, about her mother, who had died coughing blood into handkerchiefs she tried to hide. She told him about entering the convent at 18, not from faith, but from desperation, because it was the only path that led away from the marriage her father had arranged. He was 45 years old, she said, sitting by Nathan's bed in the dim light of the oil lamp. A merchant who wanted a young wife to give him sons and keep his house. My father owed him money. I was the payment. So you ran. I ran to the only place a woman could run. Behind walls, behind vows, behind a God I wasn't sure I believed in. She looked at her hands, calloused now from years of hard work. But then they sent me west to Arizona to teach Apache children, and I found something I hadn't expected. What purpose? She smiled, but it was sad at the edges. Those children had nothing. Their world was being destroyed around them, their parents killed or driven onto reservations, their entire way of life erased, and I could give them something. Reading, writing, skills that might help them survive in the world that was coming, whether they wanted it or not. Nathan listened, watching her face in the lamplight. She was beautiful, he realized. Not in the soft way that Eastern women cultivated, but in a harder way, a fiercer way, like a blade that had been forged in fire and come out stronger. What happened to them, he asked. The children you taught. Grace's face closed. Most of them died in the attack. A few escaped with the warriors who were away hunting that night. She paused. Little Fawn survived. She was staying with relatives in another village when Reed came. That's why Jacob will help us. That's part of it. But Jacob lost his parents in that attack. His village. His home. He wants Reed dead as much as we do. She met Nathan's eyes. Maybe more. On the third day, Nathan's fever broke and the infection began to recede. He could move his arm without the grinding pain that had immobilized him, though the shoulder remained stiff and sore. Grace allowed him to get out of bed to walk around the cabin to begin rebuilding his strength. While he moved through exercises he remembered from his cavalry days, she spread her evidence book on the table and explained its contents in detail. 47 documented incidents over 5 years, she said, turning pages covered in her small, precise handwriting. 23 attacks on Apache villages. 15 attacks on white settlements that were blamed on Indians, 9 land transactions that followed the attacks, always benefiting the railroad or its associates. Nathan studied the pages, his jaw tightening with each entry, and Reed is connected to all of them, directly or indirectly. Sometimes he led the attacks himself, sometimes he sent subordinates, but every order, every authorization, every payment traces back to him. She pointed to a list of names. These are his accomplices, 12 soldiers who participated in the killings, 5 businessmen and railroad officials who profited. And these, she turned to another page. These are witnesses, people who survived, people who saw things they weren't supposed to see. How many are still alive? Some, enough to corroborate the documentary evidence if we can get it in front of a judge who isn't already bought. Nathan sat down across from her, the weight of what they were attempting settling on his shoulders. This is bigger than revenge, he said slowly. This is bringing down an entire system. Yes, Grace's eyes held his. Reed isn't acting alone. He's the sharp end of a much larger blade. The railroad wants land. The government wants the Indian problem solved. Men like Reed are useful because they're willing to do what needs to be done without asking uncomfortable questions. She closed the book. If we expose him, we expose all of it. The corruption, the murder, the conspiracy that reaches all the way to Washington. That makes us very dangerous to very powerful people. It does. Nathan considered this. A week ago, he had been a man hiding from his past in a cabin in the mountains. Now he was contemplating war against an army colonel backed by railroad money and government connections. But what was the alternative? To let Reed continue, to let more families die the way Sarah and Thomas had died, to let the men who had destroyed everything he loved go unpunished. When do we leave? He asked. Tomorrow, at dawn. Grace began rolling up the evidence book in its protective oilcloth. I sent a message to Jacob through channels the Apache use. If he received it, he'll meet us at Eagle Rock 3 days' ride from here. And if he didn't receive it, then we'll have to find another way. But Jacob will come. He knows what's at stake. They were loading the last of the provisions when the sound of approaching hooves echoed through the canyon. Nathan had his rifle up before the echo faded, moving Grace behind him with his free hand. But the rider who emerged from the canyon mouth was alone, an old man on a tired horse, his beard gray and his face weathered by 60 years of frontier living. Harlan Briggs, Nathan said, lowering the rifle but not holstering it. You're a long way from your spread. Had to come. Briggs dismounted stiffly, his joints creaking with age and hard use. Got news, Cole. News you need to hear. Inside the cabin, Briggs drank 2 cups of water before he could speak. His eyes moved from Nathan to Grace to the supplies piled by the door, but he didn't ask questions. Not yet. Reed's gone crazy, he finally said. After Dawson came back with his tail between his legs, Reed declared you a traitor, harboring hostile Indians. He's putting together a force to come after you. How many? 100 soldiers, regular army. Another 50 militia volunteers. Briggs shook his head. But that ain't the worst of it. Reed's planning something bigger. A final solution to the Apache problem, he's calling it. In 5 days, he's going to hit every Apache camp in the territory. Kill everyone, men, women, children. No prisoners, no survivors. Grace went pale. The camps near Fort Apache, Jacob's people. All of them. Reed says by the end of the week there won't be a living Apache left in Arizona. Briggs looked at Nathan. I've known something was wrong for years. The attacks that didn't make sense. The land deals that always seemed to favor the railroad. But I kept my mouth shut because Reed has power and I have a family. He paused. But this is too much, even for me. Why are you telling us this? Because I'm tired of being a coward. Briggs straightened in his chair, some of the old soldiers showing through the aged rancher. And because I know things. Reed pressured me to sell part of my land last year, threatened me when I refused. I've talked to others, he's done the same too. We're not organized, but we're angry. He looked at the evidence book on the table. Dawson says you have something, proof of what Reed's been doing. Grace hesitated, then opened the book and showed him several pages. Briggs read slowly, his face going from pale to red to something harder. This is enough to hang him 10 times over. If we can get it to a judge who isn't in his pocket. Harrison Wells in Tucson. Briggs nodded. He's honest. maybe the only honest judge in the territory. But getting to him means getting past Reed's men. They've got the main roads watched. We're not taking the main roads. Nathan began strapping on his gun belt. We're going through the mountains, through Apache territory. Briggs raised his eyebrows but didn't argue. What do you need from me? Time, information. And when the moment comes, I need you to gather every rancher who's been hurt by Reed. Every man who's lost land or family or livelihood to his schemes. Nathan met the older man's eyes. When this breaks, it needs to break big. Public. Impossible to cover up. I can do that. Briggs stood, extending his hand. I spent 30 years keeping my head down and my mouth shut. Reckon it's time I stood up for something. They shook hands, two men who had fought different wars but recognized the same enemy. 5 days, Briggs said as he mounted his horse. That's how long you have before Reed moves on the Apache camps. Whatever you're going to do, do it fast. He rode out the way he came, disappearing into the canyon as the sun climbed higher. Nathan and Grace left within the hour. They rode hard through the first day, pushing the horses as fast as the terrain would allow. The route Grace had chosen avoided all established trails winding through canyons and over ridgelines that barely qualified as paths. Nathan's shoulder ached with every jolt, but he ignored it. Pain was just information. It told you something was wrong. It didn't mean you had to stop. As the sun began to set, they reached higher elevations where ponderosa pines gave way to spruce and aspen. The air was colder here, thin and sharp, carrying the scent of snow that would come in another month or two. Grace navigated with the confidence of someone who had traveled these mountains many times. She read the landscape like others read books, finding water sources and sheltered camping spots that seemed invisible until she pointed them out. You know this country well, Nathan observed as they made camp in a small cave that opened onto a cliff overlooking a vast wilderness of peaks and valleys. 5 years of walking these trails with Apache hunters and gatherers. They taught me to see what white men overlook. She gathered dry branches for a small fire, building it deep in the cave where the light wouldn't be visible from below. The Army calls this hostile territory, but it's only hostile if you don't know how to live with it instead of against it. That night, huddled around their small fire, Grace told him about the village where she had lived, the children she had taught, the women who had become her friends, the old medicine woman who had shown her the healing properties of plants that grew nowhere else. They took me in when they had every reason to hate me, she said, staring into the flames. My people had been killing their people for decades, but they saw past the color of my skin to something else, someone who wanted to help. Why did you want to help? She was quiet for a long moment. Because they were human beings. Because their children deserved to learn and grow and have a future. Because I had been given everything in my life except choice, and they had been given nothing but refused to surrender. She looked at him across the fire. Does that answer your question? Yes. They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who had said enough to understand each other, at least for now. On the second night, camped in a high meadow surrounded by ancient bristlecone pines, Nathan asked the question that had been forming in his mind since they left the cabin. What will you do after this is over, assuming we survive? Grace pulled her blanket tighter against the cold. I don't know. The convent won't take me back. Not after everything that's happened. And I don't think I'd want to go back anyway. That part of my life is over. She paused. I suppose I'll have to figure out who I am without the veil and the vows. You could stay. The words came out before Nathan could stop them. At the cabin, I mean, it's isolated, but it's safe. And he trailed off, unsure how to finish. Grace looked at him, her gray-blue eyes unreadable in the firelight. Are you asking me to stay, Nathan Cole? I'm saying you don't have to leave after. She held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither of them could name. I'll think about it, she said finally. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no either. On the third day, they reached Eagle Rock. The landmark was unmistakable, a massive granite formation that jutted from a mountainside like the head of a giant bird. According to Grace, it marked the edge of territory that the Army had learned to avoid. Too many patrols had entered these mountains and never returned. They made camp in the shadow of the rock and waited. Nathan kept watch while Grace rested his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the tree line for movement. The waiting was the hardest part. It always had been. During the war, he had spent countless hours in positions just like this one, watching for an enemy that might come from any direction at any moment. At least in the war, he had known who the enemy was. The Apache appeared without warning. One moment, Nathan was alone watching the forest. The next 7 figures materialized from the shadows between the trees, moving with a silence that made his skin prickle. They were mounted on horses that seemed to have been chosen specifically to blend with the landscape, their coats mottled brown and gray. The man at their head was tall and lean, with the build of a lifelong warrior. Black hair hung loose around his shoulders, held back by a leather band decorated with eagle feathers. His face was angular, almost sharp, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Grace was on her feet before Nathan could speak, moving toward the riders with her arms open in greeting. She called out in Apache words Nathan didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear from her tone. Relief, welcome, family. The leader dismounted and embraced her, holding her close for a long moment. They spoke rapidly in Apache, the conversation punctuated by gestures toward Nathan, toward the mountains behind them, toward the direction they had come from. Finally, the man turned to face Nathan directly. She says you saved her. His English was accented but clear, the product of years of contact with white settlers and soldiers. She says you gave her freedom when you could have kept her as property. Nathan met his gaze without flinching. She saved me too, more than once. Something that might have been approval flickered in those dark eyes. I am Jacob Whitehorse. Grace tells me you have evidence against Reed. Evidence that could destroy him. We have evidence. Whether it will destroy him depends on getting it to the right people. And you want my help to travel through our lands, to avoid Reed's soldiers? Yes. Jacob studied him for a long moment, his warriors arrayed behind him in a silent line. Reed killed my parents, my village, most of my people. His voice was flat, controlled, but something terrible moved beneath the surface. For 3 years I have wanted to kill him. But killing one man would only bring more soldiers, more death, more destruction. He looked at Grace. She says your way is better, that this evidence can bring him down without starting a war we cannot win. If we can get it to Judge Wells in Tucson. Tucson is 100 miles from here, through territory Reed controls. Jacob paused. But there is a complication. Reed's attack is not in 5 days. It comes tomorrow at dawn. Grace went pale. How do you know? We captured one of his scouts this morning. He talked before he died. Jacob's expression showed no regret. Reed spread false information deliberately. Told everyone the attack was in 5 days so his enemies wouldn't have time to prepare. But his soldiers are already moving into position. The women and children, Grace whispered, are already being evacuated. My scouts are leading them to hiding places the soldiers will never find. Jacob's jaw tightened, but we cannot run forever. And we cannot fight 100 soldiers with 20 warriors. Not in open battle. Nathan leaned forward. What if you didn't fight them in open battle? All eyes turned to him. I spent 4 years as a scout for Sherman. I know how military formations move. I know their weaknesses. And I know that 100 soldiers can be defeated by 20 fighters if those fighters choose the ground and control the engagement. Nathan began drawing in the dirt with a stick. Reed expects to attack a sleeping village. What if instead he walked into an ambush? What if his column was stretched thin through a narrow canyon with warriors on the heights above? What if every advantage he expects is turned against him? Jacob studied the crude map, his dark eyes calculating. You would help us do this. Reed killed my wife and son. He spent 8 years walking free while their graves grew over with grass. So yes, I hate him as much as you do. Something shifted in Jacob's expression. Respect perhaps, or recognition. Then we will make him pay. Together. He looked at Grace. But you must continue to Tucson. The evidence is what matters most. If we fail tomorrow, if every one of us dies, the evidence must still reach the judge. I can't just leave you both to. You can, Nathan's voice was firm, and you will, because Jacob is right. The evidence is bigger than any one battle, bigger than any one of us. Grace looked between them, her jaw set with frustration, but she knew they were right. 2 of my warriors will escort you, Jacob said. Running Elk and Gray Wolf. They know paths that will get you to Tucson in 3 days moving fast. And if Reed's men find us, then you do what you've already done. You survive, you fight, you get the evidence to the judge no matter what it costs. Jacob's eyes held hers. That's the burden you chose when you started keeping that book. See it through to the end. They spent the night planning. The canyon Reed's forces would march through was narrow with steep walls and limited visibility. Jacob's warriors would position themselves on both sides hidden among the rocks. When the column was fully committed, they would attack from above with rifles and bows, creating chaos and confusion. Nathan would be with them, using his sharps to pick off officers and NCOs disrupting the chain of command. The goal wasn't to kill every soldier, but to break their will to fight to make them retreat in disorder. And then what? One of Jacob's warriors asked. They regroup and come back stronger. Then we're already gone, Nathan said. We scatter into the mountains. They'll never find us in terrain we know, and they don't. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern peaks, Grace prepared to leave with her 2 escorts. She had the evidence book secured in a leather satchel along with supplies for the 3-day journey to Tucson. Nathan walked her to her horse. Come back, she said, her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. That's not a request, it's an order. Yes, ma'am. He reached into his pocket and withdrew one of the silver coins, the one he had paid for her. Keep this. If something happens to me, give it to Judge Wells. Tell him it represents a debt paid, a life saved, a choice made. She took the coin, her fingers closing around it tightly. Nothing's going to happen to you. Maybe not, but if it does, I want you to know. He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. Meeting you changed everything. These past few weeks, they gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose, hope, the ability to feel something other than hate. Grace reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the scar that ran from temple to jawline. Then come back and feel some more. She mounted her horse and with Running Elk and Gray Wolf flanking her, rode south toward Tucson and whatever destiny awaited. Nathan watched until they disappeared over a ridge, until there was nothing left to see but the endless expanse of mountains and sky. Then he turned back to Jacob and the waiting warriors. Let's go kill some soldiers. Part 3, The Reckoning. The canyon was perfect, narrow enough that the soldiers would have to march in a column 4 men wide, steep-walled enough that climbing out under fire would be nearly impossible, long enough that by the time the rearguard realized they were under attack, the vanguard would already be in chaos. Jacob's warriors positioned themselves along both rims, hidden among boulders and scrub brush. Each man had a rifle taken from dead soldiers or traded for at great cost. Each man knew that this might be their last battle, and each man was ready to pay that price if it meant hurting Reed. Nathan took a position on the north rim. His Sharps rifle rested on a flat rock that gave him a clear field of fire down the length of the canyon. From here, he could see nearly 300 yards, more than enough range for the weapon that had dropped Buffalo at twice that distance. They waited as the sun climbed higher. The soldiers came at mid-morning, their approach announced by the jingle of harnesses and the rhythmic tramp of boots on stone. They were confident, well-armed, expecting no resistance. After all, they were hunting women and children, old men and infants, people who couldn't fight back. Colonel Victor Reed rode at the head of the column, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. Even from a distance, Nathan could see the arrogant set of his shoulders, the casual way he sat his horse. A man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. A man who believed he was untouchable. Behind Reed came his officers, then company after company of soldiers. They filled the canyon like water filling a bottle, packed tight, unable to maneuver, perfect targets for anyone with high ground and good aim. Nathan let them come. He waited until the entire column was committed, until retreat would be as difficult as advance. He waited until Reed was directly below his position, close enough that he could see the man's face clearly. Then he fired. The .50 caliber round caught Reed's horse in the chest, dropping the animal instantly. Reed went down hard, pinned beneath the dying stallion, his leg trapped. That was the signal. Jacob's warriors opened fire from both sides of the canyon, their shots echoing like thunder between the stone walls. Soldiers fell, screaming, bleeding, dying. Others tried to return fire, but they couldn't see their attackers, couldn't find targets, could only shoot blindly at the canyon rims in hope. Officers shouted orders, trying to restore discipline, trying to organize a response. Nathan shot them methodically one after another, his rifle becoming hot from sustained fire. Major, captain, lieutenant, each shot carefully aimed, each shot finding its mark. The soldiers broke. They had expected an easy massacre. They had found a killing ground instead. And without officers to lead them, without any clear enemy to fight, they did what frightened men always do. They ran. Some tried to retreat back the way they had come. Others tried to climb the canyon walls, scrambling over rocks, while bullets kicked up dust around them. A few, the brave or the stupid, tried to hold their ground and fight back. All of them died or fled within 15 minutes. When the shooting stopped, the canyon floor was carpeted with bodies. Not all dead, but enough. The survivors limped or crawled away, leaving behind their weapons, their wounded, and any pretense of military order. Nathan climbed down from his position, moving carefully over loose rock and scree. Jacob met him at the canyon floor, his rifle still smoking. "Reed?" the Apache warrior asked. "Alive." Nathan pointed to where the colonel still lay, pinned beneath his dead horse, his face purple with rage and pain. "I saved him for you." Jacob walked to where Reed lay and looked down at the man who had destroyed his world. "You know who I am?" Jacob asked in perfect English. Reed spat blood. "I know what you are. A savage. A dead man." "No," Jacob shook his head slowly. "I am the son of Running Deer, who you murdered in his sleep. I am the brother of Little Bird, who was 7 years old when your soldiers shot her. I am the voice of every Apache you killed because we stood between you and land you wanted." The law is in Tucson," Jacob interrupted, "being presented to a judge by a woman you tried to silence, a woman who documented every crime you committed." He knelt down, bringing his face close to Reed's. "You are not going to die today, Colonel. You are going to stand trial. You are going to hear the names of everyone you killed read aloud in a court of law, and then you are going to hang. You'll never get me to Tucson. Your men are running back to their fort as fast as their legs will carry them." Nathan stepped forward, his own rifle pointed at Reed's head, and the ones who might have stayed loyal. "They're dead in this canyon." He reached down and pulled Reed out from under the horse, ignoring the man's screams of pain as his broken legs shifted. Together, Nathan and Jacob bound Reed's hands and legs, then secured him to a trowel made from pine branches. "We take him to the fort," Nathan said. "We turn him over to the remaining officers with a message. The evidence is in Tucson. The judge knows everything. If they want to avoid being implicated in Reed's crimes, they'll cooperate." Jacob considered this, then nodded. "And if they don't cooperate, then we leave Reed at their gates and ride for Tucson ourselves. But either way, he's finished." They reached Fort Apache by nightfall, the travois bearing Reed dragging behind Jacob's horse. The fort's gates were closed, guards nervous on the walls. Nathan rode forward alone, his hands visible and empty. "I'm Nathan Cole, Captain United States Army, retired. I have Colonel Reed in custody for murder, conspiracy, and crimes against citizens of the United States in the Arizona Territory. I'm turning him over to you for transport to Tucson to stand trial." There was a long silence. Then a voice called down from the wall. "Captain Cole, Nathan Cole, who scouted for Sherman." "The same. This is Captain Hayes, Samuel Hayes. I was a lieutenant under your command at Vicksburg, sir." Nathan's memory flickered. A young man barely 20, eager and brave and terrified all at once. He had survived the siege. 15 years had passed. The boy would be a man now. "Open the gates, Captain. We need to talk." Inside the fort's commander's office, Nathan laid out everything: the evidence book, the attacks, the railroad conspiracy, the murders of Apache and white settlers alike, all orchestrated by Reed for profit and land. Captain Hayes listened with a face that grew increasingly pale. "I knew something was wrong," Hayes said when Nathan finished. "Reed's operations never made military sense, but I had no proof. Nothing I could take to the authorities without being dismissed as insubordinate or worse. Now you have proof." Nathan pushed copies of documents across the desk. "These are orders Reed gave. Financial records, witness statements, everything Grace collected over 6 months of being sold like an animal while she gathered evidence." Grace? The woman Reed tried to silence. The nun who saw him massacre an entire village and decided to make sure the world knew what kind of monster he was. Hayes picked up the papers, reading slowly. With each page, his expression hardened. My God, he killed hundreds of people. And he would have killed hundreds more if we hadn't stopped him today. Nathan leaned forward. But stopping him isn't enough. He needs to face justice, public justice, the kind that makes sure this never happens again. I'll take him to Tucson myself, Hayes decided, with a full escort. And when we get there, I'll testify to everything I've seen, everything I suspected but couldn't prove. Then we have an understanding. Nathan stood extending his hand. Captain, Hayes shook it firmly. Sir. The trial of Colonel Victor Reed began 3 weeks later in Tucson's largest public building, a former church converted into a meeting hall. Over 300 people attended, ranchers from across the territory, merchants, miners, soldiers. A delegation of Apache led by Jacob Whitehorse, who had emerged from the Canyon battle as something of a legend among both his people and the white settlers who had fought alongside him. And in the front row, sitting between Nathan Cole and Harlan Briggs, was Grace. She had made it to Tucson safely despite 2 encounters with Reed's men who were hunting for her. She had delivered the evidence book to Judge Harrison Wells, along with the silver coin and Nathan's message. And then she had waited, growing more worried with each day that passed without word from Nathan or Jacob. When they finally arrived, battered and bloody, but alive, she had run to Nathan in front of everyone, embraced him, wept against his chest while he held her, and whispered that everything was going to be all right now. No one had looked away. No one had judged. After everything they had endured, after all the lives lost and saved, the idea that a former nun and a retired scout might find comfort in each other seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Judge Wells called the court to order and the trial began. Grace took the stand first. She read from her book, her voice clear and steady, recounting 47 incidents of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. She named names, she provided dates. She showed the financial records that proved the railroad's involvement. When she finished, the silence in the hall was absolute. Then the witnesses came forward. Harlan Briggs testified about Reed's pressure on ranchers. Captain Hayes testified about suspicious orders and operations that made no military sense. John Patterson's widow testified about her husband's final words describing the white men dressed as Comanche who had murdered their neighbors. Jacob Whitehorse testified in fluent English about the night his village burned, about watching soldiers shoot children as they slept, about Reed standing in the firelight and laughing. And finally, Nathan Cole took the stand. He spoke about Kansas, about a homestead that had burned 8 years ago, about a wife and son who had died while he was away, murdered by men dressed as Comanche, their lands stolen by a railroad that paid pennies on the dollar. He produced the document Grace had found, the order signed by Reed, authorizing the neutralization of the Cole homestead. I spent 8 years hunting for the men who killed my family. Nathan said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. I became a ghost living in the mountains, dead to everything except revenge. And all that time, the man who ordered their deaths was being celebrated as a hero, as a man bringing civilization to the frontier. He looked directly at Reed, who sat in shackles at the defendant's table. He's not a hero, he's a murderer. And every day he walks free is an insult to every person he killed, every family he destroyed, every life he ruined in the name of progress and profit. As the trial neared its end, Judge Wells called one final witness. The court calls Elizabeth Reed. A gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman in black stood from the back row, her face pale but determined. She was perhaps 40 years old, elegant, despite her obvious distress. Mrs. Reed, Judge Wells said gently, you are the defendant's wife. You understand you are not required to testify against your husband. I understand, Your Honor. Her voice was steady, but I have something the court needs to hear. She approached the stand, refusing to look at her husband. For 5 years, I have known what my husband was doing. I found documents in his study, letters from railroad executives, payment records. I confronted him once. She paused. He told me if I ever spoke of it, he would have me committed to an asylum, that no one would believe a hysterical woman over a decorated colonel. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a thick envelope. These are the original contracts between my husband and the Arizona Pacific Railroad. They show he was paid $50,000 for each cleared section of land. They show the names of every official involved. She finally looked at Reed. I stayed silent because I was afraid, but I won't be silent anymore. Not when I see what you've done. The courtroom erupted. Reed lunged from his chair, screaming obscenities, fighting against his shackles. Judge Wells banged his gavel repeatedly, finally restoring order. The jury retired to deliberate. 2 hours passed, then 3. As the fourth hour approached, tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Reed's lawyers were smiling, whispering among themselves. A hung jury would mean a mistrial, another chance for the railroad to apply pressure. Nathan watched Grace's face go pale. They had come so far, sacrificed so much. If the jury couldn't reach a verdict. Suddenly, the jury room door opened. The foreman, a rancher named Thomas Mackenzie, who had lost his brother to one of Reed's Indian raids, stepped forward. "We have reached a verdict, Your Honor." Judge Wells nodded. "What say you?" Mackenzie looked directly at Reed, his weathered face hard as stone. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Colonel Victor Reed, guilty on all counts." The courtroom exploded. Reed lunged from his chair, again screaming threats, fighting against his shackles. It took 4 bailiffs to restrain him as he was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting, "I'll have you all killed, every one of you. The railroad owns this territory. You're all dead men." Judge Wells banged his gavel repeatedly, finally restoring order. "Colonel Victor Reed," he said it, his voice cold as winter, "you have been found guilty of 47 counts of murder conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and crimes against the people of the United States and Arizona Territory." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "I hereby sentence you to death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out in 60 days. Reed's screaming could still be heard from the hallway as they took him away. Reed's railroad backers tried to intervene. Lawyers filed appeals. Telegrams flew to Washington calling in favors demanding clemency. But the evidence was too strong, the witnesses too credible, the crimes too public. 4 months later, on a cold morning in February of 1879, Colonel Victor Reed was hanged in Tucson's town square. Over 1,000 people attended. Some came to celebrate. Others came to mourn. Most came simply to witness the end of a monster. Nathan and Grace did not attend. They had already said their goodbyes to that chapter of their lives. They had already decided what came next. The wedding was small, held at Mission San Xavier del Bac outside Tucson, 8 months after Nathan had bought Grace for $2 in a dusty trading post yard. Father Michael O'Brien, who had helped Grace navigate the complications of leaving her religious order, performed the service. Jacob Whitehorse stood as witness for the groom, a statement of alliance and friendship that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Little Fawn, now 15 and studying to become a teacher herself, stood for the bride. Grace wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself. Her hair had grown enough to pull back with tortoiseshell combs, a practical style that suited her. She wasn't the terrified woman Nathan had bought for $2 in a dusty trading post yard. She was something new, something forged from pain and purpose. Nathan wore his cavalry uniform, the one he had kept packed away for 15 years, cleaned and pressed for one final wearing. The scar on his face was visible, but his eyes were different now, softer, more alive. The eyes of a man who had found his way back from the dead. They exchanged vows in English and Spanish, the old words taking on new meaning when spoken by people who understood what commitment meant, what sacrifice looked like, what love cost when you had lost everything and somehow found your way to something new. When Father O'Brien pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan kissed Grace gently, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. She kissed him back fiercely, reminding him that she was stronger than she looked. Afterward, there was a small celebration. Jacob brought Apache musicians who played drums and flutes. The mission provided food and wine. People danced and laughed and celebrated the marriage of two people who had every reason to surrender to bitterness, but had chosen hope instead. As the sun set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and gold, Nathan and Grace stood together on the mission's wall, looking out over the land that had almost destroyed them both. "What now?" Grace asked, leaning against him. "Now we build," Nathan said. "We find a place, we make it ours. We help people who need helping. A school. If you want, a home certainly, a place where Apache and White can learn that they're not so different, that they can live together if given half a chance." That's ambitious. So was keeping a book documenting a colonel's crimes while being sold from one owner to another. Nathan pulled her closer. So was a nun teaching Apache children in a territory that wanted them all dead. "We're not exactly people who think small." Grace smiled. "No, we're not. They returned to Nathan's cabin long enough to gather what they wanted to keep, then traveled north to Montana Territory. The land there was cheap, the government eager to encourage settlement. They bought a section near the mountains close enough to water and timber, far enough from towns that they could build something of their own. The first year was hard, building a home, planting crops, learning to work together as partners rather than survivors. There were arguments, frustrations, moments when the weight of what they had endured threatened to crush what they were trying to create. But they endured. In the spring of 1880, they opened a small school on their property. It accepted students of all backgrounds, white and Indian alike, at a time when such mixing was controversial at best and illegal at worst. Education is the foundation, Grace told anyone who would listen. If we want a different future, we have to raise different children. Some people were suspicious. Others were hostile. But the school survived, growing slowly each year as word spread of its quality and its commitment to treating every student as worthy of learning. In 1882, they adopted their first child. Samuel was a 6-year-old Apache orphan whose parents had died in one of Reed's raids. He was angry and scared and convinced that all white people wanted to hurt him. Grace worked with him for months, patient and persistent, never pushing, but never giving up either. Nathan taught him different lessons: how to ride a horse, how to shoot a rifle, how to track game through the wilderness, how to be strong without being cruel. They named him Samuel Hayes after the man whose testimony had helped convict Reed. Samuel was difficult at first, prone to rages and nightmares and long silences that worried Grace. But slowly, with time and patience and love, he began to heal. He began to trust. He began to imagine a future beyond survival. By the time he was 12, Samuel was the top student in the school. By 15, he was helping to teach the younger children. And when he turned 18, he announced that he wanted to become a doctor. "Why a doctor?" Nathan asked him. "Because I want to heal people," Samuel said simply, "instead of hurting them." They found a way to send him to medical school in San Francisco, one of the few institutions that would accept a student of mixed heritage. It took every dollar they had saved, and some they had borrowed, but they made it work. Samuel graduated in 1903 at age 27, one of the first Native American physicians in the United States. He returned to Montana and opened a clinic that served everyone regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. "He's our legacy," Nathan told Grace on the day the clinic opened in 1904. They were both 68 years old now, their hair white, their hands marked by decades of work. Grace smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "Yours and mine together." They adopted 2 more children over the years. Sarah, named after Nathan's first wife, who grew up to become a teacher like Grace. Thomas, named after Nathan's son, who became a lawyer and spent his career fighting for the rights of indigenous peoples. The school grew into a community. Former students returned to work there, to raise their families there, to build something that would outlast any individual life. What had started as 2 people seeking refuge in the mountains became a settlement, then a town, then a legacy that would endure for generations. Jacob Whitehorse visited often, bringing news from his people and wisdom from his years. He and Nathan developed a friendship that surprised them both, built on mutual respect and shared loss and the understanding that came from having fought the same enemy. "We were supposed to be enemies," Jacob said once, sitting on Nathan's porch as the sun set over the mountains. "Our peoples have been killing each other for generations." "We were supposed to be a lot of things we never became," Nathan replied. "That's what choice is for." Grace died in the spring of 1907, peacefully in her sleep, with Nathan holding her hand. She was 70 years old. Her last words, whispered in the darkness before dawn, were simple: $2. Best investment I ever made. Nathan buried her on the hillside overlooking the town they had built together, in a spot where wildflowers bloomed every spring. He visited her grave every day, telling her about the children and grandchildren, the students and teachers, the endless small dramas and large triumphs of the community she had helped create. He lived another year without her, growing quieter with each passing month. The children worried about him. The grandchildren tried to keep him engaged. But everyone could see that part of him had gone with Grace, that he was waiting for permission to follow. On a winter night in 1908, 72-year-old Nathan Cole sat in his leather chair beside the fire, telling his grandson Daniel about the woman he had bought for $2 in an Arizona trading post 30 years before. He told him about courage, about justice, about the choice to build instead of destroy. And when he finished, as dawnlight crept through the windows and Daniel prepared to leave for his war, Nathan reached into his pocket and withdrew a silver coin, the mate to the one Grace had carried to Tucson. "Keep this," he said, pressing it into Daniel's palm. "Let it remind you that value doesn't come from what something costs, but from what you do with it." Daniel left that morning carrying the coin and the story and the knowledge that he came from people who had faced darkness and chosen light. Nathan watched him go, watched the young man disappear over the hill toward the train station, toward the war, toward whatever destiny awaited him. Then he turned back to the empty house. But it wasn't really empty. Grace was there in the quilt she had sewn, in the books she had read, in the photographs on the walls, and the memories embedded in every beam and board. And beyond the house and the town, they had built the school they had founded, the children they had raised, the lives they had touched. $2. That was what he had paid for her in a dusty Arizona trading post a lifetime ago. And she had given him back the world. 3 weeks later, on a quiet afternoon when snow fell soft outside the windows, Nathan Cole died peacefully in his sleep, slumped in his leather chair. The leather journal lay open on his lap to the final page where Grace had written in her neat hand, "We are not defined by what was done to us, but by what we chose to do after. We were bought and sold, broken and betrayed, destroyed and rebuilt. And from the ashes we made something beautiful. Let everyone who reads this know redemption is always possible. Love is always stronger than hate. And $2 spent in compassion can change the world." They buried him beside Grace on the hillside. The entire town attended, along with people who had traveled from across the state and beyond. Apache and White stood side by side, united in grief for a man who had helped build a bridge between worlds that had been at war. Samuel Hayes spoke at the funeral, his voice strong despite his tears. "My father bought my mother for $2, he said. That's how this story begins, with an act of commerce that should have been meaningless, should have been forgotten, but instead became the foundation for everything we are today." He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of every color and heritage, at the community that existed, because two broken people had chosen to build instead of surrender. They taught us that healing is always possible, that justice is worth fighting for, that love is stronger than hate, even when hate seems overwhelming. Samuel touched the headstone that would mark his father's grave. They taught us that every day, every moment, we get to choose what kind of person we want to be. And they taught us, he concluded, his voice breaking, that $2 spent in compassion can change the world. The crowd dispersed slowly, people lingering to share memories and stories. But long after everyone else had gone, a figure remained by the grave. Jacob Whitehorse, now an old man himself, his hair white and his face carved with the years of a hard life, stood looking at the graves of his friends. "You were supposed to be my enemy," he said quietly. "You were supposed to be everything I hated, but instead you became my brother." He placed an eagle feather on each grave, the highest honor his people could bestow. "Walk in peace, my friends. You have earned your rest." Then he too was gone, and there was only the wind in the pines and the mountains standing eternal against the sky. And on the hillside, two graves side by side marked with simple stones that bore the names Nathan Cole and Grace Cole, and beneath them a single line, "They paid $2 and changed the world."